It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10. Our top story. The Assad regime under pressure. Rebels sweep into one of Syria's biggest cities after a surprise offensive. In Ukraine, as President Zelensky talks to us about scenarios to end the war, we witness the toll the conflict is taking. Also ahead, after the Commons vote on assisted dying, questions about how the legislation could impact families and the health service. Back on the streets, protesters are out in force in Georgia again after 2 nights of violent crackdowns by police. Counting continues in Ireland as the 2 centre-right parties close in on re-election. Plus, the Princess of Wales is to join other members of the royal family at a Christmas carol service next Friday. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30. Good evening. We start tonight in Syria, where President Assad is facing the biggest threat to his rule in years. Militant groups are thought to have taken full control of the country's second-largest city, Aleppo. The Syrian army says it has withdrawn to prepare for a counter-offensive, while the Syrian government's ally, Russia, says it's hit rebel positions with airstrikes. The conflict began in 2011 when unhappiness with the rule of Bashar al-Assad triggered pro-democracy protests as part of the wider Arab Spring. The regime's brutal response spilled into a full-blown civil war. The rebels, including Islamist factions, took eastern Aleppo, Syria's second city, in 2012. In 2016, backed by Russian airstrikes, Assad's forces pushed the rebels out of Aleppo. Now, the rebel fighters are back, led by a Sunni Islamist group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, based in Idlib province, the last opposition enclave. Anti-regime forces say they now control all of Idlib province and from there swept into neighbouring government territory, reaching Aleppo in just 3 days. Our international correspondent, Alex Rossi, reports.
Their descent on Aleppo has been blistering in its speed, taking the Syrian regime and the world by surprise. Opposition fighters now control much of the city, and they're vowing to take the capital, Damascus, next. So far, they've met little resistance, skidding cars in one of the main plazas in celebration. And in the advance, symbols and statues of the Assad dictatorship are not being spared, toppled wherever they once stood. This war was dormant, at a stalemate, but not anymore. Aleppo is a huge prize for the rebels, as it was a major centre of power for the regime.
To see the entire city fall in 24 hours, as we did yesterday, is, I mean, beyond dramatic. It's like an earthquake in the scale of the last 13, 14 years of the Syrian crisis.
It is uncertain when this lightning attack will end. It started just a few days ago, with the rebels quickly moving through the countryside. The people here can't believe how suddenly it's changed.
We suffered greatly in the refugee camp, complaining to God. But when I returned yesterday and today to the village and found it liberated, it was an indescribable joy.
The landscape here has been pummeled by artillery with smoke and the sound of shelling echoing across the horizon. The opposition, backed by Turkey and led by the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, say the offence has been launched to stop government airstrikes on its territory in northwest Syria.
We in the Military Operations Department stand up to our responsibilities to put an end to the transgressions of this criminal regime and protect our people.
The attack shows the weakness of President Assad's regime as its allies fight in other wars, with Russia bogged down in Ukraine and Iran and its proxies weakened in the conflict with Israel. Syria's dictator has been left exposed. Syrian and Russian jets are now launching heavy counter-strikes. This is the aftermath of an assault on central Aleppo. The ground is covered with blood. For the last few days, opposition fighters have been virtually unopposed. But President Assad's government says it's temporary and is vowing to push them back.
And Alex Rossi joins me now. Alex, just how significant is this rebel push and what's likely to happen next?
Well, I think it's highly significant. Just how significant really is the big question tonight. Nobody really knows. These are very uncertain times. Everybody has been taken by surprise with the speed and ferocity of this assault on Aleppo. The international community has been taken by surprise. The government regime of President Bashar al-Assad, even the rebels. This started off as a limited operation, but surprised by how little resistance there was. They barreled into the city, the second city in Syria of Aleppo, and now control pretty much all of it. They are vowing to go further. They're talking about taking Damascus. How likely that is hard to say at this moment. We know that President Assad has been to Moscow to ask his backers in the Kremlin for more help. We think that that has been given with the noises being made by Vladimir Putin's government. And we are hearing tonight that there have been Syrian jets in the skies above Aleppo, as well as Russian jets, and they are starting airstrikes. They're also vowing to launch a ground counter strike as well. The question, of course, is will it be successful and will they be able to roll back this tide of opposition fighters?
Alex, thanks very much for that update. Meanwhile, just across the Syrian border in Lebanon, the Israeli military says it's launched airstrikes on Hezbollah smuggling sites. The IDF says the smuggling of weapons from Syria is a violation of the ceasefire agreed earlier in the week. Our correspondent Tom Cheshire has visited Hezbollah's main stronghold in the Beirut suburb of Dayer, where he had rare access to a highly protected site under strict Hezbollah control, open now for the first time, and where the group's former leader was killed.
They came to see the place where their soul and heart was killed. That's what Hezbollah calls Hassan Nasrallah, their former leader. The US, the UK and Israel and others called him a terrorist.
He means a lot to us, more than our children, more than our brothers, more than our families.
This is not the main goodbye, but of course, this is the first opportunity to see where he died. He's our dignity, our pride.
It's clear that even in death, though, he still inspires. Condemnation elsewhere, devotion here, as they chanted his name. And this is what they came to see, a bomb site and a shrine, a memorial and a rallying cry for the future.
I come here to tell the people and tell the Israeli soldiers that we are strong and we don't fear them, and we will always stay strong.
They thought that by assassinating him, they had defeated him, but his blood will rebuild in the future. Many generations will avenge him.
You get some idea of the loyalty Nasrallah inspired and why he was target number one in Lebanon for Israel. This is the airstrike that killed him on September the 27th, a series of huge bombs. They had to be. He was hiding deep below the surface in what the Israeli government said was Hezbollah's underground HQ. The ceasefire Israel and Hezbollah agreed to this week, still holding, meant that the site could be reopened in Daher, a southern suburb of Beirut. And the media was invited in first.
The emotion here is palpable. This is the first time people have been able to come in large numbers to the site of this strike, which did happen 2 months ago. But this isn't about history. This is about the battle for memory, about the battle for the narrative of the future.
But the weeping crowds also show the scale of Hezbollah's difficulty and Israel's success. They have a new leader, but how to replace a figurehead with this sort of following? How to replace your soul and heart? There is defiance here. But what's newer is the sense of some defeat. Tom Cheshire, Sky News, Daher, Beirut.
In Gaza, the Israeli military says it has killed a Palestinian man it accuses of being involved in Hamas's October the 7th attack. The IDF claims the man was also employed by the World Central Kitchen. According to local reports, 3 of the aid group's employees were killed when a vehicle was struck in Khan Yunis. The charity organisation released this statement in response. We are heartbroken to share that a vehicle carrying World Central Kitchen colleagues was hit by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. At this time, we are working with incomplete information and are urgently seeking more details. World Central Kitchen had no knowledge that any individual in the vehicle had alleged ties to the October the 7th Hamas attack. World Central Kitchen is pausing operations in Gaza at this time. Our hearts are with our colleagues and their families in this unimaginable moment. To Ukraine now, where President Zelensky has suggested for the first time that he may be prepared to give up parts of his country temporarily. During an exclusive interview with Sky News, he said he could make concessions as part of a ceasefire deal amid reports that morale is low amongst soldiers who aren't adequately equipped to continue the war. One thing is clear, Ukraine's president is looking for a way to end the conflict. Thousands have died since Russia's invasion. And as our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey reports, every day the number rises.
In the morning mist, family, friends and comrades of this war gather at the beautiful St. Michael's Monastery in Old Kiev. Another funeral service for a soldier killed in battle. There are so many of these services, they are so common, it's easy to forget another life has been lost. Another family left in grief. Pavlo was 34. He's been fighting since he was 24. It's also easy to forget this war is 10 years old. The country's president is looking for a way to stop the fighting. He is acutely aware of the sacrifices his people are making. Painful sacrifices, but not in vain, he says.
I believe that these people who are no longer with us, they already have prevailed. Putin has not realized it yet, but Ukrainians have already won. And Ukrainians who are no longer with us, they put everything they had at stake, and they are already winners. Because if Ukrainians had not united back then, sacrificed their time, their life, their comfort, then Putin would have conquered the whole of Ukraine.
An expert on international affairs, Hanna Hopko, believes that joining NATO and the security it brings would be good for Ukraine and indeed the rest of Europe.
Ukrainians, after such sacrifice, when almost in each family we have someone either wounded or in the battlefield on helping our armed forces. So we understand that with bad deal, Russia will repeat its aggression again. So this is why the issue of security guarantees is existential one. It's critically important. It's crucial for all of us.
People come to St. Michael's to pay their respects to the dead and to remember them. The pictures of thousands who have died in this war with Russia are posted onto the monastery walls. It started as a single picture, now it stretches into the distance. A reminder to everyone that some form of peace, however imperfect, is desperately needed here. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Kyiv.
Here, the full implications of yesterday's Commons vote on assisted dying are still being digested. The bill would allow adults with just 6 months left to live to request medical assistance to end their lives. Our correspondent Dan Whitehead has been speaking to care home workers who say the details are absolutely key to getting the legislation right.
It was an historic vote, decades in the making. But the decision made inside the four walls of Parliament has implications that flow far wider.
So what do we think's for dinner today? Something interesting?
Some people, like Tess, deal with death more than others. She supports the bill, and as a care home manager, is now digesting just how it would work.
We look after people to the end of their life anyway, and I have been doing that now for 40 years. All that it would be was that when somebody actually says to me personally, Tess, I can't do this anymore, I've had enough, that at that point I can get other people involved.
Tess says the law must be strict in who decides.
I would like to think that if it goes through, then they stick to what they're saying. It has to be somebody that has capacity, can make that choice for themselves. No coercion, nothing from anybody else. They say, I've had enough and I want to die now.
As the bill moves forward, opinions remain divided.
I think that people are stuck and that their quality of life is poor and their family around them recognise that, and that it's important to be able to give them that choice.
I don't really agree with it, if I'm being honest with you. I just don't see the legal side of things, how you can suddenly go and do something like that.
I feel like palliative care is the way forward, really. Not that I think people shouldn't be allowed to choose. I'm very torn.
It could still be a few years before this bill actually becomes law, and there is still a chance that it could fail. What happens now is that there will be months of scrutiny and debate, and the shape of that is a key focus for those on the front line. It is, of course, not just a fundamental change for the public.
One of the big things that we would like to see is an absolute freedom of choice for doctors as to whether they participate or not. This is obviously important for doctors, but it's important for patients as well, who really would need to know that the medical staff they were encountering were fully trained, fully supported and fully committed to the process.
Lobbying and campaigning will continue. There are more votes to come. But for now, many will consider just what this new power could mean for us and our families. Dan White is Sky News in Tetbury, Gloucestershire.
The first round of counting is nearly complete in Ireland's general election, and it looks like the two main parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, will be the ones trying to form a government coalition again, but probably without the Greens this time, who are on course to lose several seats. Sinn Féin look likely to fall short of the performance suggested by the exit poll and end significantly down on their 2020 vote. But a convoluted voting system means the final result and the prospects for a coalition may not be known for several days. Well, first counts have been completed in 34 of the 43 constituencies so far, with just 18 of the 174 seats decided. And this is the state of play. Fine Gael and Sinn Féin are tied with 6 seats apiece, followed by Fianna Fáil with 4 seats. Independents are performing strongly with 12% of the vote and 1 seat so far, with the Social Democrats and Labour the best of the rest in terms of vote share. Beyond the top 6 parties, both Aontú and Independent Ireland have picked up 1 seat each. Well, let's cross to David Blevins now in Dublin. David.
Yes, Ireland votes by proportional representation, so the counting takes a while. But the Fine Gael leader, Simon Harris, he's the current Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, the Fianna Fáil leader, Micheál Martin, and the Sinn Féin leader, Mary Lou MacDonald, have all been re-elected to the Irish Parliament. Now, as things stand, it looks like 2 of those people, Simon Harris and Micheál Martin, will repeat what happened 4 years ago, when their centre-right parties set their rivalries aside and came together to form a coalition. But they're on course to record their lowest combined vote total on record. So they're going to need a smaller party to get them to the required majority. With a warning that his report contains flash photography from the outset. Sky's Stephen Murphy has the story of the Irish election.
The first major party leader to retain his seat, Fianna Fáil leader Micheál Martin celebrates in Cork.
Well, I think there is a very clear route back to government, although it's not fully determined, because a lot will depend on those final seats that I've spoken about.
As counting continues, the number of seats filled is still small, but the trends are clear. Micheál Martin could be set to head back to government with the Taoiseach Simon Harris easily elected on the first count in Wicklow.
Simon Harris comfortably returned in his own constituency. The big question now is, can he return as the leader of the next Irish government?
Are you confident that you can now return as Taoiseach?
I think anybody who makes any projection about who is going to be the largest party or the construct of the next government, I think they're a braver person than I am. But what I am very confident about is that my party will have a very significant role to play in the years ahead, and I'm cautiously optimistic and excited about what the weeks ahead hold.
Mary Lou MacDonald putting a brave face on things this evening, even if Sinn Féin's path to government remains unclear.
We understand that that vote was for change, for a change in government. And I and we will do everything that we can once the voting's finished and the seats are filled to pursue that goal.
That will require speaking to other parties of the left. For now, the bookies don't rate her chances, but there's still a way to go. Counting in Ireland is long, very long. And all of this before the horse trading for government partners can even begin. Stephen Murphy, Sky News in County Wicklow.
One of the big takeaways from this election is that Ireland is bucking the European trend. While the issue of immigration featured heavily in debate before the election, only 6% of people said it influenced how they voted, compared to 28% who were really concerned about the extortionate cost of housing in this country. That significantly increased the number of young people voting for Sinn Féin. So after 100 years of domination by the two big parties on the centre-right, Sinn Féin has firmly established itself as the third presence on Ireland's political landscape.
David, thank you. Officers who investigated Labour MP Louise Haig's alleged stolen phone believe that a photo that she submitted of the handset had been taken after its theft was reported. Sky News has heard that metadata attached to the photograph led the officers to believe it had been taken after the date of the incident, so it couldn't have been stolen. The Sheffield MP resigned as Transport Secretary on Friday. Well, let's cross line to Westminster now with our political correspondent Ali Fortescue. Ali, remind us of the background to this story.
Well, look, Gillian, the background, I have to say, is not at all clear-cut. It is quite confusing, and I think that's the reason that we are still talking about it, because there are still so many unanswered questions. We know that this is an offence relating to Louise Haig giving incorrect information to police about a stolen work phone. She said that at the time she was mugged, she thought the phone was stolen. She then later went on to realise it wasn't stolen. She turned it on. That triggered the police attention. She said that her solicitor told her to plead guilty, and in her own words, she said that she pleaded guilty despite the fact that this was a genuine mistake from which I did not make any gain. Well, now, as you say, two sources have told us that a photo that she submitted as part of that investigation into this stolen phone, so it was meant to be about helping find the stolen phone, that photo was actually taken after the alleged mugging, according to metadata, according to two sources. So that potentially an important update. We also have three sources saying that Louise Haig pursued this report into the stolen phone for her own personal gain. There are lots of unanswered questions, as I say, unanswered questions too about what the Prime Minister knew and when. People around Louise Haig suggesting he knew about this criminal conviction when she was appointed to the Cabinet, but a Number 10 spokesperson saying new information came to light, suggesting that the former Transport Secretary had not been totally clear with the Prime Minister. We know she has resigned, the Prime Minister, who said when Boris Johnson was in government that lawbreakers can't be lawmakers. Well, she had to go. She did resign. But I think if the Prime Minister and former Transport Secretary thought that that would draw a line under this, well, I don't think that has happened. And as I say, still lots of unanswered questions.
Indeed. Ali, thank you. Protesters have taken to the streets for a third night in Georgia, despite a police crackdown on the demonstrations. This is the scene in the capital, Tbilisi, where there's been fury over the government's decision to delay EU membership talks. Critics also accuse the governing party, Georgian Dream, of working with Russia to rig last month's elections. Our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, reports from Tbilisi.
It is cold and bleak in the north of Georgia. This is a rugged, poor landscape and an area laced with tension. This is the border with South Ossetia, the region occupied by Russia. We drive to the checkpoint, and the guards tell us to leave. There are thousands of Russian troops on the other side of this crossing, a lingering warning to Georgia that invasion forces can return. Levan has lived here all his life. Both he and his car have survived for more than 60 years. He never forgets the Russians nearby.
You always hear gunshots. They hold military exercises in what used to be Georgian villages. There's a firing range and they shoot there. What can I say about the feeling? Both adults and children, we get used to it.
Down the road, Zura is on his way to work. He says he feels safe, but he's wary.
Russia wants territory, not people. This place is already full of Russians. They keep coming. This place is already Russified.
As we move around, the police follow us. Nerves here are taut. Well, the border with South Ossetia is just along this road, and on the other side of it there are thousands of Russian troops. And as Georgia debates whether it should develop closer ties with the West and risk upsetting and aggravating Moscow, the towns and villages around here feel that debate particularly because they remember the day when Russia invaded, when its tanks rolled along these streets. You can't ignore the links between Georgia and Russia. After all, this is the country where Joseph Stalin was born. Now, the governing party here has announced it will postpone negotiations about joining the EU, sparking fresh protests and a sense Georgia is drifting back towards the arms of Moscow.
It's clear that the current Georgian leadership, the rhetoric that they are using, the choices that they make, it's actually leaning towards Russia.
There are plenty here who would fear that. But there are also those who look at the Ukraine war as a warning of the dangers of provoking Russia's anger. Marina's finding a few last customers at her market stall. She's weary of her country's problems.
Georgia is moving through a difficult time. We move towards Europe and Russia threatens us. Georgia is hanging by a thread.
The anger here persists. More protests, clashes with police. But others are wary of provoking Moscow. This is a worried nation stuck between East and West. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Tbilisi.
It's been announced tonight that the Prince and Princess of Wales will join other members of the royal family at the Together at Christmas carol service at Westminster Abbey next Friday. Ahead of the concert, Kensington Palace has released a letter from the Princess of Wales, which will be shared with attendees at the service, thanking them for all they've done to provide comfort and hope to those who need it most. Here's our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, and a warning that her report contains some flash photography from the start.
The princess was already there to meet her family last year as they arrived for her carol service. At the time, no one could have predicted the year that they would face. Now, ahead of this year's event, for the first time, Kate has written a letter to the congregation to thank them for everything they do to help others. Christmas is one of my favourite times of the year, she writes. It is a time for celebration and joy, but it also gives us the opportunity to slow down and reflect on the deeper things that connect us all. It is when we stop and take ourselves away from the pressures of daily life that we find the space to live our lives with an open heart, with love, kindness and forgiveness, so much of what the Christmas spirit is all about. Other parts of the letter are reminiscent of the updates that she's given throughout the year. Love is the light that can shine bright, even in our darkest times, she writes. We're also told the carol service will reflect her message about the importance of nature for healing, with the Abbey decorated in sustainable festive foliage. But this is an event she hopes will recognise others. Lindsay Burrow, the wife of Rob Burrow, who Prince William awarded with an honour earlier this year, will light a candle at the service. Along with Sir Chris Hoy, who recently announced his own terminal cancer diagnosis. Kate's public appearances have been limited this year, but Remembrance Sunday and the Carol service were both events we were told that she was determined to attend. In tone and sentiment, her letter in some ways feels reminiscent of the monarch's annual Christmas message, in a year where they've both publicly shared their health battles in the hope it may help others. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News.
Time now to catch up on the latest sports news with Nick.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
You got more chance of winning the lottery than making it as a professional footballer.
I think your responsibility is to guide them in the same direction as I went myself.
Things aren't just handed to you on a plate. I think you have to fight for them, and it's probably only the tough that survive, really.
Natural skills is not enough. The impact has to be straight away.
Don't let anyone tell you what you can and can't do.
If you have that belief, then that's the most important thing.
Keep it fun for as long as possible. If you love what you do, you'll be able to get through the tougher times.
If you're going to make it as a professional, pressure's coming, so we don't want the kids feeling it prematurely.
The top club, we don't have time and space to grow up the young. He plays if he's good enough.
Whether it's playing in the parks, competing in cages, or showcasing skills on the streets, for so many young boys, the dream is to become a professional footballer. But the reality is, 0.06% of them will ever achieve that dream. The stats, newly released after extensive research by Sky Sports, make difficult reading for all those aspiring youngsters. 1.65 million boys play our national sport, but of those, less than 1% of them make it into a club's academy system. From there, just 9% of those go on to make a single professional appearance. At the very top level, in the Premier League, the numbers are even smaller. Only 1.5% of academy players make it there. For those who do, it's a job like no other. For the vast numbers who don't, the reality can be hard to take. This is the home of football. For any young English academy player, the dream is to play here, at Wembley. We know that the journey to get there is incredibly difficult, but what's behind that journey? People know the statistics that so very few players go on to make it as a professional. But what's the truth behind those statistics? And how do young academy players make it to the very top? The starting point for this is to meet a man who wants to know more about academy football. He's spent more than 50 years in the professional game. He had 400 matches as a player and over 1,000 as a manager. It's fair to say he knows a thing or two about professional football.
This was my home for 16 years, Dolphin Street. Hasn't changed much. 8 of us lived in that house. You can't believe it, can you? Irrespective of your upbringing or you know, where you're from, you know, it's that spirit that hopefully you can galvanise into be determined enough to be successful. You can be a working class boy with ambitions.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, John Yates, and Global Affairs Correspondent at The Eye, Molly Blackhall. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front of the Sunday Times. Their headline, Dying Bill piles pressure on courts and NHS. We'll be right back. Do stay with us.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and 'Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island. The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe.
Sky News, get the full story first. Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out.
The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here. In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
The most significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America? People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty? I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, John Yates, and Global Affairs Correspondent at the Eye, Molly Blackhall. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the front page of the Sunday Times says Cabinet Ministers have privately warned that legalising assisted dying will eclipse the government's priorities and heap pressure on the country's public services. On the front of the Sunday Express, the MOD orders £37 million of kit from China, which critics have called a needless risk to national security. The Sunday People claims the BBC show MasterChef had its own hotline for upset members of staff amid allegations of misconduct against former presenter Greg Wallace. Meanwhile, a producer for the show alleges Greg Wallace undressed in front of colleagues and guests, but that complaints about his behaviour weren't acted on. Banijay UK, the production company who makes MasterChef for the BBC, says it's conducting an immediate external review to investigate the allegations. The Mail on Sunday claims Cabinet Minister Liz Kendall, who axed pensioners' winter fuel payments, has her energy bills for her London mansion paid for by the taxpayer. Coronation Street fired me over an historic sex lie, says actor Sean Wilson. That's on the front page of The Sun on Sunday. We have contacted ITV for comment. And the Sunday Mirror leads with a Christmas charity appeal as the number of missing people soars to record numbers this year. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, John Yates, and Global Affairs Correspondent at the Eye, Molly Blackhall. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, and it's a photo. Quite telling, that's all there is. But this is the rebel drive into Aleppo and possibly further in Syria against Bashar al-Assad.
It's a striking image, isn't it? The huge flag against the piercing blue background, and it basically says Syria's back in the news again, as if there weren't enough horror from Gaza or from Lebanon. Now it's the civil war we'd all forgotten about, and it does feel like Back to the Future. I mean, this is the civil war, 500,000 lives lost, 30 million people, about half of Syria's population, some people estimate, have been displaced. But it had gone from the news headlines for a long time, and that's largely because it felt like some sort of settlement had been reached where the rebels had the north and the regime had the rest. Well, we're back to Aleppo, and it doesn't look like that settlement is holding because, as many of us will have heard, the rebels have managed to re-invade again and take this second biggest city in Syria. And I think that the big question is, what comes next? I mean, is this just a small one-off push and actually everyone just resettles back into this new position? Or is this the start of the civil war getting going all over again? It's pretty unsettling for the world at the time when we could do with some things being settled down.
Indeed, but the rebels themselves seem to be more surprised than anyone that they've got this far and potentially could go on to Damascus, but it just has taken everyone by surprise.
Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of been the frozen, forgotten war, as you said, John. You know, it's been sort of largely in a sort of stalemate, I guess you could say, since about 2020. And it really has happened very, very suddenly. It seems like government forces didn't put up all that much of a fight. You know, there's been reports of them sort of fleeing en masse, leaving weaponry behind. So it certainly took them by surprise, and I think has exposed some weaknesses within the Syrian forces themselves.
Do you think it's a coincidence that this happened now?
No, I don't. I absolutely don't. I mean, I think if you look at the key players involved here, they're all tied up in other things. You know, one of the reasons that Assad stayed in power in 2011 when all this broke out with the civil war was because of the support that it had for Russia. And today we seem for the first time since 2016, Russia bombing Syria once again. Russia's obviously focusing its efforts on Ukraine at the moment, and there's plenty of developments going on there. And the other major support was Iran and Hezbollah, who are also fighting on their own front with Israel and have both taken serious hits to their capacity. These things don't happen in a vacuum. And I think, you know, absolutely there will be strategy here, looking at what's going on and looking at whose hands are tied sort of elsewhere to see if they can almost exploit the chaos that we're seeing.
It's quite hard to see any of this as really good news. I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind would have much sympathy for the Assad regime. But the rebels are a really motley crew of some people, I think, really standing up for people to be defended, but some people with some pretty extremist views as well. So I was trying to work out what is the possible silver lining here. I think one person who might be slightly pleased about this is President Zelensky. I mean, you're going to see the Russians a bit distracted at a period where they obviously are taking huge ground in Ukraine. Everything seems connected at the moment, without meaning to sound like a conspiracy theorist.
And we're entering those crunch talks in Ukraine as well. I mean, you know, Zelensky was telling Sky News, actually, where he stands on a peace plan at the moment and potentially hinting he might even cede territory to try and win, to try and end this war, you know, one way or another. So, as you say, it will take the heat a little bit, you would think, off Zelensky, but the question really is for how long?
Yes, but as you say, all interconnected. Yes, we are our brother's keeper. To the Sunday Express, and this interesting story coming from the Ministry of Defence, that Britain's armed forces are being kitted out and clothed by China. Critics describing this as a security risk to national security. John?
The papers are weird today in that they're a mix of, like, really serious stories and some, what I would say, slightly silly stories. I think this is a slightly silly story.
Is it?
So I think it actually is. So look, let's break it down. So look, on the one hand, it sounds terrifying, right? £37 million, big amount of money. We're apparently giving to China, who are potentially a strategic rival, potentially a threat, and they're going to be putting all the clothes on our forces. And heaven knows, there could be trackers on them. They could. I find it a bit hard to get really worked up about this. I mean, there's this brilliant bit from Ian Duncan-Smith, who's professionally worried, I think, about this issue. and he rather brilliantly says, what will we do if we can't get it from China? Where will we get our uniforms? Well, considering this is a £60 billion market for the provision of uniforms, can I suggest Bangladesh or Vietnam or India or any of the other myriad of countries who, at the drop of a hat, this is not very much provision of uniforms. This is a drop in the ocean of, like, a massive... It's a bit like me buying, or my kids, let's be honest, buying a couple of things from Shein and then going, but what if Shein's closed? Where will I get my clothes? You just buy them somewhere else. This is not a massive risk to our safety.
Molly, do you agree that is there any security risk there? Is there a more serious
security
story?
risk, I think, doesn't massively concern me on this one. I find it very hard to believe that boxes are just going to come in from China and nobody is going to, check them or look over them. And at sort of baseline, I do think China probably have more resources available to them than sort of stitching things into British uniforms. I expect their surveillance capacity is more advanced than that. I would think if they want to know about these things, they could probably find out in other ways. I think the question is more around supply chains, which is not a very sexy part of defence, but actually is very, very important. There's a kind of common thing being talked about in the military at the moment that you are only as strong as the supply lines which can supply you. The industry which is backing you up. If you go to war but you've got nobody to make the shells, you can't go to war, put bluntly. And I think what this does raise a question of, though admittedly, as John says, on quite a small scale, is about having a sort of sovereign supply line here. Are we self-sufficient? Are we able to, if needs be, scale up independently? Because I think, Ian Duncan-Smith might be being slightly hyperbolic here, but he does make a point. If China do invade Taiwan and it's not a relationship that can be kept up, what happens then? We need to make sure, I think, the feeling is in defence circles that we are ready to sort of stand on our own 2 feet. Now, Labour have made some moves towards that. They've made a new National Armaments Director whose sole job it is to look at procurement and supply lines. So I think they do recognise this as an issue. But I think there's a really telling bit in this, which is right at the end, which is that Whitehall sources say they're not going to cancel these contracts. And that's because they offer value for money. And that's fundamentally what underpins all of these kind of decisions. There's been massive cuts to the armed forces over the past 2 years, some figures saying about 10 billion in real terms since 2010. That comes at a cost, and that is fundamentally going to tie the hands of whoever is making difficult procurement decisions.
So regardless of where the kit comes from, it's how much it costs.
How much it costs.
Which is quite a sensible thing to worry about, isn't it? I mean, because there'll be another headline. Let's say they change this and they build... Ian Duncan-Smith sets up his own factories and we run home-built for British soldiers, British vestments, and therefore we found that British people are making some profits out of that, which they probably ought to be allowed to do. We'll then have a headline saying, money taken by fat cats, which could be sent protecting our men on the front line. I mean... I just think this is a bit of...
You should get into the headline writing.
You're in the wrong industry. It's been done this.
And Molly, we have run out of time. We're going to leave it there for the moment and take a break. Thanks very much for the moment.
Thank you.
Still to come, should MPs still be assisted with heating bills as some pensioners' winter fuel payments are cut? We'll look at that issue on the front of the Mail on Sunday and more coming up after the break. Stay with us.
The judge made it very clear that she could see no justifiable reason why Sakoulas wasn't here facing British justice.
I promised I would get him justice.
Sky News, get the full story first. It's legal to let go. Set the speed and take the hands off. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
A show of military might and menace. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Sky News. Get the full story first.
Have a quick word for Sky News. Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine? American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display.
I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends.
We've got a heck of a race.
This is when the Premier League properly clicks into gear. With the reigning champions against perhaps their most likely challengers. Liverpool, Manchester City, the summit meeting of English football's top two.
Liverpool, Manchester City on USA.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
This conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America? People want their country to work.
You want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, John Yates, and Global Affairs Correspondent at The Eye, Molly Blackhall. Let's take a look at the Sunday Times front page and obviously the story of the week, the assisted dying bill being voted on Friday. This is looking at ministers privately warning that the country's most broken public services, the justice system and the NHS, will be brought under further pressure should this become law.
It's not very private, is it, when it's on the front page of the Times?
Well, there are no names.
Yes, we might be able to guess who it might be. The bill is past its second reading, but this isn't over by any stretch, and we're now into practicalities. And I think that there's going to be really big debates about, I think, a couple of things. One is, at the moment in the bill, a doctor can raise this with a patient. They can say, have you considered? I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about that. Secondly, you've got to believe that the patient has 6 months or less to live. Sometimes that assessment changes. So how do you know it's definitely right? I think we're going to get into a lot of this, where we've got the two main cabinet ministers responsible for the courts and for the health service voting against and saying there are some real logistical problems. So I think this is going to be pretty tough going for a few months yet.
Yeah, I think it was stark to hear Wes Streeting, obviously the Health Secretary, voicing opposition basically on this basis that, you know, some resources are going to have to be moved towards this because there isn't sort of infinite supply. But I thought there was a really interesting point from Labour grandee Harriet Harman, who said actually on an issue like this, which is so sort of morally and ethically charged, you actually should make a decision outside of cost implications, outside of logistics almost. And as government, that might sound a bit like an odd thing to do, but she was saying once you start to look at what's cheaper, you know, you start to make decisions on people's suffering, on people's lives, you know, based on what costs the least or the most. And actually, that's the wrong way to do it. So she was arguing that what you should do is come up with a line on this, you know, come up with a stance and then work out how you implement it.
Like we did for the Brexit vote, we didn't have any plans of how we're going to implement it, and that worked out incredibly well. So.
Still a work in progress. We've got time to just look at this Mail on Sunday story. Is it a story? Winterfield Minister's heating bill is paid by you. What are your thoughts, John, on whether this is actually even a story?
It's a silly one. I mean, to play it straight, right? Liz Kendall, pantomime baddie. Apparently the government's taking away winter fuel payments, but she still gets her fuel paid for. Even worse, she gets some housing rental paid for. She gets a car to take her into work sometimes. She gets her insurance paid for. Because she's an MP and she has to live in 2 different places. I mean, what do we want? Do we want the MPs to just be homeless? And although she's got to be in Leicester and London, she should sleep on the street with no heating? I mean, we will end up with appalling people as MPs if we don't look after them a bit. This is a nonsense story. And it's turned up to the max, but it's a ridiculous story.
Molly?
I think it touches a nerve here, which I think is what John is sort of slightly alluding to. I think people are very sensitive to the idea that there's one rule for some people and one rule for another. And I think we saw that in the extreme around Partygate. And I also think we see that in the extreme around the cost of living. You know, people are directly feeling that pinch. It was only this week we've heard from the Bank of England, half of people with mortgages, their rates might go up. I think people feel sensitive on this.
Wait till they hear that the Prime Minister has a house that he lives in the centre of London. It's extraordinary.
John and Molly, we must leave it there. We'll see you in the next hour. Thank you very much for taking us through the papers. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, selfies and celebrations amongst Syrian rebels after they overrun one of the country's biggest cities.